My name's Tony Morbin, Editor-in-Chief at SC Media UK. Today I'm going to be joined by Stuart Reed, VP Market Strategy at NTT Security. We're going to be looking at the results of the NTT Security 2018 Global Threat Intelligence Report and just discussing some of the details on it. Stuart, the report covers Europe, Middle East, Japan, Africa, US, APAC. But today we're going to be looking at the global results and also EMEA and seeing how the regions compare. But first, can you give us a feel for the report as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Global Threat Intelligence Report, or GTIR, is NTT Security's annualised report that highlights notable incidents, attacks and general trends that we're seeing from a security standpoint or a threat landscape perspective across the world. We analyse that from over 6 trillion logs and 150 million attacks, and that is channeled through our Security Operations Centre. We then analyse all the data inputs and we add a level of context to it, which then splits it out between industries and verticals and geographies as well, from a global and from a regional perspective. Interestingly, for this year's report, we're seeing a rise in the number of attacks on the finance sector, and also we're seeing a huge amount of activity, in fact a 350% rise from the number of ransomware attacks that we've seen compared to last year. So I think what the report really underlines for us is that attacks come from anywhere and they attack anywhere. There is no one particular industry or one particular geography that is immune from cybersecurity attacks. But in terms of the interesting points that have been risen through this report, we're seeing certainly finance is a big attack vector this year compared to last year. We're also seeing technology attacks rise as well. And interestingly, technology is now one of the top 5 most attacked industry segments across all geographies. So it's really starting to establish itself as one of those attack vectors. But similarly, we are also seeing that the manufacturing sector, the healthcare sectors, the gaming sectors, they are all being targeted for cybercriminal activity in varying amounts across the different geographies. The theme that we are seeing through the report is around ransomware, and whilst that still is relatively small from a global perspective, it's sitting at around 7% as a choice of attack. That, if you compare that to last year at just 1%, represents a huge increase in the amount of activity that we're seeing generated through ransomware attacks.
So when we look at the actual sources of attacks, we see China on 21%. I think we've got US next at 18%. The UK comes a long way behind at 5%. And then we have places like Norway and Germany on 4%. Does that mean that we've been downplaying China as a source of attacks, or overplaying Russia, or what can we actually tell from these figures?
Well, I think what's really important is to put these results and these numbers into context. And what we're saying here is that the nature of the source is from these particular geographies, but that's a very important distinction from who is actually carrying out the attacks themselves and where the actual perpetrators or cybercriminals are residing. It simply means that they're using or utilising the resources in these particular geographies, and those are the pieces that we are seeing within these results. So the IPs or the known bad websites are residing within those particular geographies.
Now, when we looked at the actual sectors under attack, I mean, finance, as you rightly point out, globally is the number one, and that's not a surprise because they've got the money. Technology companies, IT is a major area for IP, so that's obviously under attack. But then we have business and professional services at number 3. And the use of, which you touched on, known bad sources. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about business and professional services, and what are these known bad sources?
Okay, so in terms of the known bad sources, what that really means is that through a various number of indicators, we have determined that an IP address or a website is known to be malicious or known to be bad. And that could be because historically it has carried out or been part of attacks in the past, or it may be that we've already put it onto our blacklist, or it is on a blacklist of one of our trusted third parties. So that's really what we mean when we talk about a known bad source. In terms of business and professional services, you're absolutely right. We're seeing that this year increase in terms of the number of the significance of impact within that sector. I think for EMEA, we're looking at something around 20% for professional and business. But what's probably worth drawing out is really what we mean when we talk about those sectors, because it is a sector that doesn't naturally fit into an area that produces anything of any tangible product. So it's not a manufacturer, but it may be a business services, it may be an outsourcer itself, or it may be an accountancy firm, a lawyer's firm, or some kind of service practice. And what's really interesting is that the reason for compromising or attacking these particular verticals or these particular sectors may not necessarily be to attack or to gain knowledge from those particular sectors. Of course, from an accountancy or a legal perspective, that may indeed be the case. But where some of these smaller outsourced services form part of a much larger supply chain, it may be a stepping stone for the cyber criminals' activity to be able to reach a much bigger enterprise and the real target of their malicious activity. To draw reference to the manufacturing, it's a really interesting area, especially as we look at the UK. It's accounting for nearly 50% of all the attacks that we're seeing from a UK perspective alone. And the reasons for that could be quite varied. The interesting development within manufacturing as a general principle is that it's becoming far more reliant on digitization. There's a lot more process automation that's taking place on the production line. There's a lot more operational efficiencies that are being driven out of the adoption of technology and disruptive technologies. And as a result of that, by very nature, it becomes far more open as a footprint to attack vectors, and therefore it becomes a much bigger target in terms of being able to be exploited through cyber criminal activity.
Why is the UK, why is it so prevalent here as a malware, 29% compared to 7% globally?
Yeah, there's a huge variation in terms of the geographies of ransomware, but I think that the main point that the report is outlining is that the use of ransomware as a vehicle to launch attacks has grown significantly and is likely to continue as we move forward as well. In terms of the spike within Europe, it may well be that it was because the biggest or most high-profile attacks that we saw last year were actually launched within the EMEA region. So they by effect of that, they would be impacted first before some of the other regions.
What should we actually be doing about these new changing threats?
Yeah, and I think this is again underlines the point that threats are evolving and they are continually changing. I think also what this outlines is there isn't a silver bullet, so there isn't one thing that you can do that will mitigate all of these things. Cybersecurity needs to be very much a layered approach that an organisation takes. So that starts right with the basics, so getting those basics in place, those basics right, making sure that the systems are patched, making sure that you've got the latest versions of security software, antivirus for example, making sure that you're using passwords, that those passwords are adequately protected, and that you're applying a layer of authentication on some of those things. And it also expands out into a wider incident response planning activity as well. So as well as having the basics in place, should the worst happen, you need to know what policies and procedures you've got in place to be able to mitigate and reduce the impact of those risks once they come into play. And there also needs to be a collective responsibility still around these things. Individuals, employees, everybody has a role to play in a mature approach to cybersecurity. And what we have within the Global Threat Intelligence Report this year is further evidence that the threats are still here, they can come from anywhere, and they can attack any industry. And therefore, having a mature approach to cybersecurity is really, really important.
That's been really interesting, Stuart. Thank you very much for that. You can get the full report online. Go to the website nttsecurity.com/GTIR. Thank you very much.